it was recorded as a malicious communication.
Okay.
But there would be no further action. And that to me was a very grey area. Has this been recorded as a crime or not? Am I recorded as a perpetrator here or not? Or a criminal or not? I immediately got my back up and I was like, right, okay, so if this is actually happening, I need to defend myself at this point. Now, ironically enough, and it's like the universe was working for me at that moment, this was the same day that your podcast had come out. So I immediately sent that to them and said, look, this is the history that we have with Claire Waxman in terms of trying to get her to better represent male victims, and this is the ideology that we're facing. And within a matter of an hour, they'd sent an email back saying, no, we just want to confirm that's how it was recorded when it was first reported. There will be no recording of crime here. We don't think you've done anything wrong.
This is an addendum to my recent fourth addendum to my analysis of the Channel 4 Dispatches documentary, Torn Apart, Family Courts Uncovered. Following my account of attempts to correspond with the London Victims Commissioner's Office, I was contacted by someone who told me that they had recently been interviewed by their local constabulary on suspicion of sending a malicious communication to Claire Waxman. This followed a complaint submitted to the Metropolitan Police by the London Victims Commissioner herself concerning a reply to a tweet she had posted from her MOPAC Twitter account. The Met in turn escalated the tweet to David's local police force, who carried out an investigation. After some due diligence on my part and after confirmation from the Met that David has done nothing wrong, David kindly agreed to talk to me about his troubling experience. For the uninitiated, David Mottershead lives in Wales and volunteers for several fathers' rights and male domestic violence victims charities. He grew up in Germany, where his dad was stationed with the RAF, and went on to have a career in the armed forces himself, serving twice operationally in Kosovo. He's currently studying social policies at Bangor University, and his own personal experience of domestic violence has informed his area of study, which for his dissertation involves research into the experiences of male victims, involving one of the largest data samples undertaken in the UK to date.
It happens to men too, you know.
Alright, gentlemen, let's do this.
So I've been campaigning and researching since back end of 2013, 2014. And I've always been a very considered campaigner, but in the last year, I've become more aggressive in my campaigning.
Okay. And to clarify, I mean, which direction are you coming from, kind of father's perspective? Or?
Fathers and male victims of domestic violence. So The research on the wall behind me is a research study for 728 male victims of domestic violence.
Okay.
So it will be one of the largest studies of its kind here in the UK when it's completed. And the reason my campaigning has changed so much recently, and the reason I challenge people like Claire Waxman, is because when you look back over the history of domestic violence and fathers' rights in general, you realise that the reason things are so skewed is because of 60 years of propaganda coming from the feminist so-called academic field. No other field has been more impacted by Michel Foucault, and his argument is that discourse creates its own power structures. So basically, if you can say something is real and you can get everyone to say it, then it becomes real. So it's a Marxist reification. It's what I see, and I've served my country for many years. What I see is no different to what I've seen in these devastating conflicts that I've served. That is the same vitriol, it is the same reasoning, it's the same assigning of collective guilt that I have seen every single time in these conflicts. And so for me, it's a little bit more personal, especially given that 3 years ago, I laid a wreath for David Jukes at the Cenotaph. David Jukes committed suicide. The last thing he was told by social services was that he was too dangerous to be around his children because of his PTSD. Last year, we had the coroner's hearing for a chap named Gavin Briggs, who was ex-RAF. He'd logged on to his child maintenance service account, realised that both of his ex-partners had joined forces and created a load of fictitious arrears. He logged on, realised there was an extra £15,000 worth of fictitious arrears there, and he had £9 in his bank account. So he drove straight to a Tesco's Metro, bought a disposable barbecue and a few beers, drove to an industrial estate, drank his beers and gassed himself in the car. And I was honoured to have had some involvement in being able to represent Gavin's father during the coroner's hearing. But in total, I'm aware of 8 guys who have committed suicide in 7 years from my immediate and wider circle who have committed suicide in these dynamics. So for me, it's very personal. The only time I have ever laid a wreath, been honoured to lay a wreath in front of Her Majesty at the cenotaph, I had to lay a wreath for a chap whose family had broken down and he immediately committed suicide. And because of my research, I'm aware of how bad the situation is, not just for the veteran community, but for the entire sort of male populace within the westernized world now. And knowing that these individuals that I'm challenging on these social media websites are aware of this data and choose to ignore it and choose to allow the situation to carry on, yeah, that's what makes me an aggressive campaigner. So.
Yeah, kind of many of the people you speak of are quite aggressive campaigners themselves, so people will have different approaches, and we can talk about, because I know we're going to get into the specifics of the incident with the London Victims Commissioner. I guess, kind of from my experience, so I know that sort of they can be very passive aggressive in their communication styles. So quite often, certainly you're the type of approach that you're describing, I can imagine that sort of, kind of will result in accusations and such.
About 7 or 8 months ago, I started on Twitter, and I've been challenging her the whole time. When I say the whole time, she's probably had 5 or 6 messages in that amount of time. Yeah. Now, the one I sent that we're talking about was, of course, the most aggressive. Before that, it was the usual way I campaign is, why are you not representing men? You are responsible for male victims as you are female victims. What I'm seeing here is you deliberately ignoring the data. And that's the way I usually challenge it. And interestingly, when we talk about accusations being made, something that small, there's no aggression there. It's a very clear message. It's a very clear question, and it can be answered very easily. The threats come immediately as soon as you start saying those things, as I'm sure you're aware. So the number one thing is you're a misogynist, then you're an incel, then it's your far right, and those accusations are extreme. They know what they're saying. That is a form of social and relational form of violence intended to do one thing and one thing alone, to use gossip, innuendo as a form of reputation destruction, and therefore isolate you from the wider social group, which is, using that terminology in itself is indicative of the entire psychological literature on how female perpetrated violence works anyway. Yeah. It's my interaction that day was, very simple. You've seen the message yourself. It was, we've had enough. The whole world has had enough. But for her to respond the way she did was quite horrifying to me. I'm used to it. I've had 5 complaints made against me at university. I was only there my first semester. I had a complaint made against me by the head of equality and gender diversity, which fortunately for me led to a 2-hour-long meeting with the chair and the vice chair of the university, and they pulled apart my political ideology. And luckily for me, Bangor University appears to be one of the last bastions of free speech, because the outcome of that conversation was, David, it's quite clear that your level of research is way beyond that of a standard degree. We agree with everything you've just said there. How would you feel about going straight on to the masters? As you can imagine, that really annoyed the head of gender diversity and equality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to ask kind of what happened there, but I think no. Let's keep going with the victims commissioner. So So what was the context of sort of on that particular day? Were you reacting to, like, for example, the program or something she'd specifically said, or was there?
Yeah, I think it was generally over the last 6 or 7 months. I think things have just built, and the picture that I'm getting from her office, it becomes darker and darker by the day, because she's not representing anyone. She's not representing female victims. She's not representing male. She's putting forward this idea that she's representing victims of domestic violence, but she's letting them all down horrendously. And by that day, I'd woken up, probably through a lot of messages from what I remember from lots of different feminists saying you're a misogynistic incel, usual stuff. And then I came across hers, and I'd had enough that day. And I said to her, as you've seen on the message, the world is waking up to this woke culture, essentially, and your days are numbered. And the intent there was to tell her, start helping everyone. Enough is enough. We don't need political ideology dictating all things domestic violence, because all you do is create further victims, whether it's the mothers, the children, or indeed male victims. And that was the emphasis of the message. And obviously that I was then very shocked when I got the knock on the door from the police.
How many days after was that?
I believe just shy of 2 weeks, I think it was in total. But yeah, I mean, I was shocked given her own behavior on Twitter. As your previous podcast pointed out, she regularly supports these really nasty, horrible individuals who openly admit on their pages they are trolls. There's one, for instance, that on their page, right at the top, the profile picture, it says, I enjoy trolling Nazis and MRAs. And she follows her.
So I suppose to some extent it depends, kind of who, which particular officer sort of looks at it. But yeah, it doesn't surprise me that, people on the front end will be saying, for decades that, domestic violence is not gendered in the way it's presented in the media. And presumably at this point, because, examples of your story are just popping up increasingly. So presumably the police are also not necessarily overly sympathetic with having their resources wasted in such a way.
Yeah,
like, quite powerful people. I mean, Claire Waxman, is in quite a powerful office and a very well paid office. So, okay, so basically, your local constabulary called on you. Can I ask sort of what time, or what was the attitudes at the door?
She was lovely. She came to the door. She said, Mr. Mottershead, yes, we've had a complaint from the office. We don't want you to worry. We would like to talk to you about it in interview, if that would be okay. Could we interview you tomorrow? So there was no particular sense of urgency. I think they realised from very, very early on that it was a non-crime. But they have to go through the process, like you say. And yeah, they were incredibly supportive. I was supported by an agency called Veterans Legal Link, which is to support veterans in Wales. They brought a solicitor from Goldsmiths, which is actually the same one as Dr. Charlotte Proudman, which is quite interesting.
Okay, yeah.
And I was lucky in that, I was advised not to, but I took 3 academic papers that I've written, two that's published, and one that's not published, along to the interview. And during the interview, I kept it very short and sweet. I just pointed out what my academic focus is, what my political ideology is, and it was obvious to them really, really early on that, number one, this guy knows what he's talking about. He's not just some bum off the street who's gobbing off on Facebook or Twitter. And yeah, I think they were worried about challenging the information that I was giving to them. But at one point in the interview, I did say to them, listen, if I can put this into context for why it's so important that people like me are doing the campaigning, consider this. I have in one of these essays that I have given you as evidence, there is an article from a newspaper in 1971 where a politician was talking about the fact that we must, whilst we focus in on domestic violence victims, we must not forget that that men are battered too, were his exact words, especially when we consider emotional battering. But he did say in there that given the heightened levels of homicide rates for women, it's important that we do focus in on female perpetrators of domestic violence. So I then pointed out that the domestic violence rates haven't reduced in all these years beyond what is the generalized reduction in rates of violence crime. And being as last year there were over 700,000 male victims of domestic violence recorded, and we know that men underreport abuse at about 3 times the rate of women. That means that there were over 1 million victims. Now, potentially, we can say around 1.2 million victims, male victims, and that's at the very lowest end of the scale. Yeah. Now, if we backtrack that, for the last 50 years, 1.2 million victims, and the numbers have always been coming down, especially for the last 30 years. If we backtrack that at the very lowest end of the estimate, that means there are 60 million male victims of domestic violence who have been ignored for the last 50 years, thanks to this genderization of the discourse around it. I said, so whilst I may seem angry sometimes when I'm engaging with these people, but that's because I'm seeing genocide level figures here. You know, would the feminist movement be as aggressive and as upset as me if those figures were true of female victims? And the answer is, yeah, of course.
Yeah. You know, two perspectives from myself would be, you know, kind of when I, you know, started to learn about this area, I very much had the perception that there were, you know, the space was involving very angry men who, you know, kind of, you know, just weren't in a place where they could constructively, you know, kind of debate their piece. And very quickly it became, you know, just when you look at it, very quickly it becomes clear that's not the case whatsoever. Some people can be, and you know, and I guess that's one of the, you know, even the sort of the nuance between men and women, that kind of men can be more direct in their language, etc.
Absolutely.
But you know, kind of that's about being kind of naturally assertive as opposed to, you know, angry or passive aggressive. I mean, you know, kind of there are examples of those, and we see that, you know, for men and women. But you know, in terms of these sort of debates, and then the other aspect of it is you do very much see that behavior, the type of behavior that a lot of these campaigners kind of project onto other people. You do see that sort of behavior from them. So, you know, it kind of makes it a bit rich from that aspect as well.
This is the thing as well, and I brought this up in the interview as well. So after just done 3 years at university, I'm still in university now, although albeit from home, but the vitriol on campus, I put £400 aside just in case I ever needed to pay for tyres, just in case they ever took my tyres out, because the vast majority of these people on campus are extremely aggressive and hysterical, I would say, in a lot of their campaigning. But I pointed out during the interview that there are over 26,000 academic papers, feminist academic papers on Google Scholar that argue for the need for anger in activism. The need for what they call feminist rage. And it's like, okay, so you're allowed to be angry, but we're not. Is that what you're suggesting here? You know, we're not allowed to have the same level of passion in our campaigning as feminists do. And yeah, the girl that was interviewing me and the solicitor from Goldsmiths, another girl, they looked at each other and went, yeah, he's right.
Yeah.
You know?
And, you know, these things, they just, I mean, they get kind of more ridiculous. But, I mean, this year we have literally seen a member of the House of Lords stand up and call for a curfew for men. Now, you know, she will claim that there's an element of metaphor in, you know, kind of what she was saying. Even if that is the case, it's deeply offensive thing to say. It's deeply disproportional, and it, you know, kind of smears all men with the crimes, a very small, small percentage of them. But the other significant thing about that, and you may have noticed this because you live in Wales, Mark Drakeford, the the First Minister, ran with that possibility. And one of, so he was serious, like, again, he will say, well, only in very extreme cases, but, the door is open to that possibility. And
exactly.
So, okay. So, I mean, obviously that has severe implications for you. Luckily, sounds like the police were kind of fairly sort of live to it. But, it's not very unpleasant to have the police calling at your door. And there are potential implications. I mean, okay, misogyny is not a hate crime yet, but presumably, had it been, would have, that whole kind of conversation would have at the very least been recorded as a hate incident. Because
absolutely. In one of the essays I wrote in university, and this got me a particularly horrible response from the feminist academic that I handed it to. That's exactly what I said, and I equated the introduction of the misogyny bill as feminism's final solution, because most coppers, policemen, men and women, struggle with domestic violence, the interpretation of coercive and controlling laws, and all of those things anyway. But misogyny is such a grey area. Myself personally, I don't believe it's a thing. I think this is an attempt at yet another reification. But given the amount of times I've been called a misogynistic far-right incel for daring to stand up and say men can be victims too, and we really need to start showing some support for men and boys, that would mean, the paper I wrote was actually called "This Time Next Year I Will Likely Be in Jail." And it was the preemptive, misogyny bills coming in. I'm definitely going to get calls about this. And it's scary. You're absolutely right. And when we talk about the segregation of the sexes, or the proposed segregation of the sexes, as we repeatedly see coming from the feminist academic field, I have complex PTSD, and I cannot stop thinking of Kosovo, where I served as an 18-year-old lad. And it was the introduction of the suggestion of the introduction of the segregating factors that caused such a divide in that society. There was a couple of families who lived around the corner from the camp where we worked, where the parents, the fathers had been best friends for years and years. But that escalated to the position where one father went through the door of the other family with a Kalashnikov and gunned down the entire family. So these arguments that we're seeing in society at the moment, they don't seem that dangerous to others. To me, they hark to some incredibly dangerous times. And it scares the hell out of me, The fact that people like Mark Drakeford are willing to even tolerate the idea that might be a solution, shows me just how bad things have become. And let's face it, feminists have been after this cultural revolution for all these years, and the problem with revolutions is that they are bloody. It scares me a lot.
I completely hear what you're saying. I guess the thing is kind of like, people will always kind of point to the slippery slope arguments, and obviously there's an element of that. But my background's Northern Ireland, so I'm very much used to the sort of sectarian divide in terms of Northern Ireland, and the solutions to addressing that, which to some extent at least has kind of happened. Not it's not perfect. One of the things in our society is that I think it's 1.6 billion is spent every year facilitating segregated services to Roman Catholics and Protestants, and housing and education and all that sort of thing, and the British taxpayer pays for it. So kind of, even if you would like to think that people would stand up before we got to the stage of concentration camps and curfews, or if this is just the paranoia of people like ourselves, the impact clearly in terms of the demonization of men and boys, It's most obvious in the domestic violence sector in terms of the complete lack of parity. And one of the things you'll know this as well is the Welsh government were found to be discriminating against male victims to their helpline. And obviously they just sort of they took it on the chin and just slightly tweaked things so that they were still doing exactly what they were doing, but were able to, kind of argue that they were getting, that it wasn't illegal anymore. So there's that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Funny you should mention that. Actually, one of the charities that I work with, the trustee, she's a very good friend. She was actually the lady that took that to the EHCR with the help, ironically enough, of Mark Drakeford.
Mark Drakeford, yeah.
He just, yeah. So
it's a funny old world, that. Yeah. So basically, you were interviewed. Did they tell you what the actual allegation was that she had put to them, or?
What they said was that the reason that they had decided to come out and interview me was because it happened on a sensitive day. So this was MP Sir Richard Amos, rest in peace, who was unfortunately killed. And it turns out that around the same time as I sent that message, that was what was happening. The impression they gave was that had the two not correlated, they probably would have told Claire Waxman where to go.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know how frequently she would be sort of making such claims. It is, the very fact her office is in MOPAC, so it is presumably quite influential in terms of Metropolitan Police, and obviously, kind of organisations will always look after their own to some extent, or, put them to the top of the queue. So there's that aspect. You'll know from kind of my last podcast, I certainly raised a allegation that she put out into the world. I was able to clarify that while she was concerned about abusive people promulgating harmful extremist beliefs, they weren't the sort of harmful extremist beliefs that she felt necessary to take to the police. So I think that says something in itself. But it also says something that she believed that your words were such as they were, and I think that's I think that's relevant as well, actually, because one of the like yourself, I presume, kind of, most people I talk to, in terms of their motivations and the reasons they've kind of come to become involved in this area and passionate about it, is just a realization of just how damaging it is to individuals, to society, and absolutely to women as well. And one of the things is around perception of safety. So, I'm not discounting the possibility that Claire Waxman genuinely has a heightened, kind of irrational fear that, kind of prompts. Now, that's not necessarily, well, it's certainly not to excuse the impact on you, and it's not to dismiss the possibility that it was, just a sort of tactical way of, shutting you up, because it does sound like you're kind of a very effective campaigner. So it may well be that people are aware of you, and that she maybe viewed that as an opportunity to try and take you out, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm aware that she is friends with people like Julie Windell. They mix in the same circles and things, and I hold them all to account when they spew that vitriol all over social media. So yeah, there is a high possibility that that's the case. In terms of, there's two things to say about what you've said there. In terms of her own perception of extremist ideology, that's the thing that gets me. She doesn't see the extremity of her own ideology. Yeah. The you can assign collective guilt, that you can lay the blame at the feet of one gender or one race of people. It's no different to what the Nazis did in Germany to the Jews. It's no different to what Chairman Mao did, what the killing fields of Cambodia, all of these things. You assign collective guilt in that manner, and you open the doors to some really dangerous things. With regards to to her own perception, that's quite interesting, because after all of this went on, I decided to do more research into Claire Waxman to get the full picture of who this individual was. And it turns out she was stalked. She's told the media she was stalked for 12 and a half years by this individual who was actually sent to jail for 3.5 years. Now, when you look at that case, and I'm guessing this is why she's become the London's domestic violence commissioner.
Very, very much so, on the back of her campaign,
It's very clear that she knew this guy in college, and he was just a bit of an awkward guy in college that used to follow. She says follow me around, but I don't believe that for 1 second. I believe it was probably follow a group around or be part of a wider group. She knew him to be awkward, so she knew him. And then she didn't hear from him in 10 years. And then she was stalked and harassed by him, and he was only sent to jail after he tried to bring a court case against her, which is quite horrendous. I don't know the full ins and outs of what she went through, but she certainly, like all feminists, misled the media to make her case seem much more severe than it was. She was not stalked for 12 and a half years. There was an uncomfortable guy in college, then there was no communication, nothing for 10 years.
I see your point.
Yeah. So, and we see that a lot, don't we? My issue with Claire Waxman is that she is what I would call an immoral actor, rather than somebody who's unwilling and being led astray by a political ideology. She did go to college. She has been to university. She is absolutely capable of doing the research and working out what the situation is. She's choosing not to. She's deliberately choosing to stick to one side of the fence. And like you've had in your previous podcasts, you've had other people mention there. As far as I'm aware, it was quite a senior justice or someone. I'm not sure who it was. At the beginning of part 4, the first lady that comes on, even she points out that what she is doing is very dangerous, and it is. And at any point, she has the cognitive ability to sit down and critically assess what she needs to for the sake of all of those victims of domestic violence in London. She's choosing not to.
So the police then eventually got back in touch with you to confirm the situation. So do you want to tell me about that?
So I was getting I do have complex PTSD, so my anxiety was up, what's going to happen here. So I tried to contact my local constabulary who conducted the interview, and I got no joy. So I rung the Met Police in London, found out who it was, and just sent a very quick email saying, please, can you confirm what's happening here? Do we have an outcome, anything like that? And the response I got was that it was recorded as a malicious communication.
Okay.
But there would be no further action, and that to me was a very grey area. Has this been recorded as a crime or not? Am I recorded as a perpetrator here or not, or a criminal or not? I immediately got my back up, and I was like, right, okay. So if this is actually happening, I need to defend myself at this point. Now, ironically enough, and it's like the universe was working for me at that moment. This was the same day that your podcast had come out. So I immediately sent that to them and said, look, this is the history that we have with Claire Waxman in terms of trying to get her to better represent male victims, and this is the ideology that we're facing. And within a matter of an hour, they'd sent an email back saying, no, we just want to confirm that's how it was recorded when it was first reported. There will be no recording of crime here. We don't think you've done anything wrong. And they actually sent me a link to the stalking and harassment stuff, and they said, just so you know, this is where she's tried to come at you from, and this is why it doesn't apply. Okay. And they were really nice about it. One of the sergeants as well said, David, don't worry about this. This has gone away. You are absolutely fine. And it was nice to hear, because especially with it being Met Police as well, they must be in communication with Claire Waxman's office on a very regular basis. So the fact that they were so good about it, so non-partisan, so apolitical, they looked at it, they realized what it was, and they were happy to tell her where to go. So I get the impression that if she is as visceral in real life as she is on social media, and if she is as bigoted and one side of the coin as she is on social media, then I'm willing to bet she's probably annoyed half of the Met Police. But at the same time, I was very encouraged, and I was very grateful to have dealt with the Met Police on that level. If and when these things come up, if I were to experience any bias, I would hold those people to account as rigidly as I would hold Claire Waxon to account. But the fact that I don't have to do that is really good. I'm very, very proud of the Met Police and the way they handled that. It's very encouraging.
But potentially the police's credibility and their potential to be, kind of have complaints successful against them if they're seen to facilitate these in a way. So that's very good. And if my video had any impact at all, I'm delighted, kind of thing. But my assumption would be, and my assumption was, and it very much sounds like it, kind of they were pretty clear even before they met you, about the credibility. So am I correct then that you have lodged a complaint against Ms. Waxman?
Well, I did question them about it, and the impression that I got was that they would if I pushed them, but it was probably a waste of police resources, and I would tend to agree with that.
The thing that we're clearly talking about with Claire Waxman is she's an example of a very influential person who is essentially a gatekeeper for equal rights. And, kind of, again, going back to the model of the likes of coercive control and abusive behavior, I honestly don't think it's, too dramatic to say that people in those positions that are deliberately denying, kind of access to justice for particular groups based on political ideology, it's just not on, particularly when there's public money involved, and there should be more accountability.
We're regulated by Ofcom. We have to be fair and balanced.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.
The Glass Blind Spot is brought to you by you, because it's your views, your likes and your comments that keep this show on the road.